Hello and welcome back. Today I'm working on another inlay bowl. I have this piece of pariri which is native to New Zealand, quite a hard wood, and it finishes very nicely. For this inlay bowl I'm going to put some larger inlays in the side here, then I'm going to put smaller inlays within them. It's the first time I've tried this, so it'll be interesting to see how they come out. Now, to save you from watching a whole lot of boring turning, I've already turned the outside of this bowl and I've sanded it up. Now it's ready for inlays, so let's get out the indexing disc and work out what indexing pattern we need. I've done all this off camera because there's a bit of mucking around and working out what needs to be done, but I'll try and explain it so that you can understand the process. The first thing we need to work out is how many inlays do we want to put around the bowl, and that depends on the size of the inlay and the size of the bowl. So you want to have them spaced right. If you've got them spaced too close together, they look very cluttered and looks like too many, and having the inlays too far apart may look like there's not enough there or too many gaps in between. These larger inlays are going to be 1 inch or 25 millimeters in diameter, and I've worked out how far the spacing is between them, and this spacing here looks quite good, so this will give us 12 inlays around the bowl. Now you may be thinking, well, why don't we just use the 12 indexing pattern? And that will work absolutely fine for these 12 inlays around the bowl here. But remember, we're going to put smaller inlays within these larger inlays. And I have to consider the size of the smaller inlays and where they sit within the larger inlay as a group. And from playing around with the indexing, it looks like this is the right area here. And those smaller inlays will be 6 millimeters in diameter. So I had to work out an indexing pattern for that, and that is the 120 indexing pattern. So that allows me to start with the center of the large inlay once that's in place, and then I'll be able to do one step forward and one step backwards for the smaller inlays from the center of that larger inlay. As I've mentioned in other videos, it's best to write all this stuff down here because you don't want to start drilling holes and end up drilling a hole like in the wrong place. Now I haven't measured how this 25mm Forstner bit cuts, so I'm doing a couple of test cuts here and a bit of scrap wood. Once that's done, I can measure it up. It looks like this one cuts pretty close to 25mm. What I don't have is a 25mm plug cutter, so I have to manually turn some oak down on the lathe. And to ensure it's nice and straight, I use a sanding block and some sandpaper to get it to finished size. I check the fit in the sample block, and I think this will work pretty good. I need to cut off around 30mm lengths, and I'm not getting my fingers down there, so I use the jig. And there they are, the 8 plugs that we need to put around the outside of the bowl. But hang on a minute, remember that number? Yeah, I've got to go make some more. Once the plugs are made, I put the bowl back onto the lathe and I start drilling out these 25mm holes. The indexing plate is moved around 10 holes because the index pattern we're using is 120. Before I started drilling, I went round and put little white marks on where I was supposed to land when I turned the indexing wheel around 10 positions. So when I actually turned it around 10 positions, then I should be on that mark. If I wasn't, then I need to investigate before drilling the hole. More holes are drilled, and this has been sped up to about 7 times the speed. Once the hole's drilled, indexing gets turned around 10 positions, and so forth. Till you get right round to the last one, and this is our last one here. And then that's it. All the holes are complete. The next step is to install the inlays or plugs. They've got a little bit of glue put on them. I try and line that grain up all the same way, and then they're tapped into the holes. And most of these inlays are a nice tight fit. You can also see that I'm using the tailstock up here just to give it some more support. I don't want the hammering to pull the bowl out of the charcoal to move it in any way. Once all the inlays have been installed, I leave it overnight so that the glue can set properly. The next day I use a multi-tool to cut the inlays off, and I'm just doing this a fraction above the surface. I don't want to go scratching the surface because it's a nice shape now the way it is. Then I use a series of pull cuts just on the inlays to get them down to the bowl surface. I do a little bit of shear scraping to tidy up any marks there. And then I sand with some 80 grit sandpaper. This is a brand new Makita 6mm drill bit, and I need to do some testing to see how the plugs will fit into the hole that it drills. I've also cut a plug out of a piece of walnut. I tested in the hole and it's firm, but it's not as tight as the other oak plugs that I did. I can't pull this out by hand, but it's still not that tight in the wood. However, I don't have any other slightly smaller drills, so we're just going to have to use what we have, unfortunately. I'm all set up ready to drill the holes. We're drilling one step down from halfway and we're drilling one step up from halfway. So 2 holes will be in this piece of oak. The holes drilled. The index is moved around 2 positions to go through the center to one above, and then we move around to the next inlay and do the same there. I go right around the bowl and I do all that off camera because that's not that interesting. The next step is to cut the 6mm walnut inlays or plugs, and I find with all the different plug cutters there's different ways that work best for removing the plug that you've cut. The plugs are then glued and then put into the hole. Now I don't have to use too much of the hammer on here, so the plugs are not that tight, to be honest. I hope this still comes out okay. All the plugs have been installed and I'm going to let the glue set overnight, and then I'll come back tomorrow and we'll clean up the outside and then we'll turn the inside. Much like the large oak inlays, I use the multi-tool to trim off the little bits sticking out from the walnut inlays. Once that's done, I bring up the tool rest, make sure we're not hitting anything there. The tailstock comes up, and then I blend these inlays into the side of the bowl. Once the outside of the bowl's done, I start to sand, and I use a mixture of power sanding and hand sanding in between the grits. Apart from the cracks there, that's come up pretty good. The next step is to hollow out the center of the bowl, and I'm using a 35-degree bowl gouge here. You keep chipping away and then you eventually get to almost the finished size. You can see that those inlays have popped through the other side here and they look really good. Once I have the inside shape complete, I use a scraper here and I've just sharpened the scraper, left a nice burr on it, and it's cutting beautifully. I frequently stop and check the progress, so it needs a little bit more there just to get those chisel lines out, and you can see the fine shavings that are coming off from the scraper here. Little whiskers of shavings, and that's what you want from your scraper. You don't want it to be scraping your wood into dust and potentially tearing out the end grain. Once I've smoothed that out with the scraper, I start to sand. I start with power sanding, and that looks pretty good there. And then I use hand sanding for the next grit. And for the rim, I use a bit of sandpaper on a stick so it's nice and flat. And you also want to just make sure there's no sharp edges on the rim. I've turned the bowl around and now I'm taking off the tenon. You can see here I'm chiseling into the inside of the bowl, and then I do some light cuts across the surface. Always make sure you have a bit of a concave in there so that the bowl sits nicely on the table. I've now removed the tailstock, so I'm just relying on the vacuum disc to hold the bowl on there. The little nubs turned away and cleaned up. Lastly, I'll do some light finishing cuts right across. As what I've done throughout this video, a bit of power sanding, and in between grits I use hand sanding. I turn the vacuum off and the bowl should just drop off there like that. That looks pretty good. This here is the best part of wood turning, putting on the finish. I'm using a spray lacquer. I turn the bowl around and do the bottom of the bowl as well, and that is the bowl complete. Now I think it's the lighting in this video, but the bowl does look kind of a little bit orange. I tried to play around with the colouring in the video, but this is the best I could get. Anyway, those inlays look pretty good, I think. Looks like a bunch of beady-eyed cats staring at you. Well, this was a little bit more challenging, particularly around the indexing, because you have to account for those smaller inlays, so you have to use a larger indexing pattern, which provides resolution for those smaller inlays. I have a few more ideas on other different types of inlays, so they'll come up in some future videos. I hope everyone has a great day, and once again, thanks for watching.